Do you have a family recipe that's been passed down for generations? Or maybe you wish you could find a family recipe that you've lost. Today, Jenny Ashcraft of newspapers.com is back, and we're going to be talking about food and family history. You're going to learn how newspapers.com can help you discover your long-lost family recipes, see how history has impacted the food of your family, what they ate, and the recipes that they used, and of course, learn about food trends over the decades. We are going to teach you some specific strategies, and who knows, you might just discover a family recipe in the newspapers. Here back on the show is friend of the show, Jenny Ashcraft. Hi, Jenny.
Hey, how are you? It's so good to be back.
It's great to have you back. And I love this topic because it's so nostalgic. I mean, we all grow up with these recipes and food. And I was thinking, food really does evoke powerful memories, doesn't it?
It does. Food brings people together. I mean, I don't know about your family, but when my family gathers, there's always food involved on some level. Food brings people together. And when you get together and there's food, though, there's memories associated with that. And I don't know if you've ever smelt something baking or had a little nibble of something, and just those memories flood back and you start to remember. That is what food does. It strengthens family traditions, and it's really a way for us to express love.
It sure does. And, you know, when we were talking about this idea and doing this show, I never really thought about the connection of family history and food. But with newspapers, why did newspapers publish recipes? What's the history on that?
Well, in the days before the internet, the newspapers were a popular way for home cooks to share recipes. Most cooks had a repertoire of things that they knew how to cook, and they did it often, and they probably didn't even need a recipe. They just knew how to put those things together. Well, newspaper recipes were a way to try something new. There were recipe exchanges in the newspaper. Those were very popular. Cooks would both ask for shared recipes, or they would share one of their favorite. Here's a little clipping that kind of illustrates that.
I love this. It almost sounds like the social media of the day.
Really, I was talking with my daughter, and she said, why would people go to the newspapers for recipes? And I said, well, how often do you go to the internet for a recipe? And she said, pretty much any time I need to make something. She doesn't own a cookbook, but that's not how it used to be. Sometimes newspapers called for readers to submit recipes. They would say, oh, fall's coming, send us your favorite soup recipes, and we'll publish a few of our favorites. Or other times they would list winners of contests. Their recipes would be published in the paper. They published specific brand recipes. For example, here is a clipping. This comes from Borden sweetened condensed milk that's for brownies. And it just shows how different brands might want to publish their recipes in the paper as a way to get people to try their brand.
Yeah, and a great marketing strategy, right? To show them how they can use their products. And I have so many of those that my mother and my grandmother has clipped out of the newspaper as well. So we know that there were lots of recipes in the papers, and our moms, our grandmas, our family members were using these recipes. And so we might actually remember them quite well, and we could try and go find them. How do you look for family recipes in old newspapers?
That's a great question. And believe it or not, searching recipe is probably not the best way to do it. But finding a recipe from one of your ancestors is so exciting. Let me just share a little example that happened just very recently with one of our customers when he discovered his grandmother's recipe for kolaches on newspapers.com. In July, we published a blog on our site. It's our newspapers.com blog. and it was about how to find your ancestors in the society pages. And one of our readers, his name was Maurice, commented that he had searched for his grandmother's name, and he wasn't finding. He wanted to know if she was in the society pages. So he was searching, and he wasn't really finding her. But as he kept adjusting his search parameters, he discovered her in the paper under her husband's name, which was Mrs. Frank Vonasek. Now, that was very common at that time. This was 1932, and it was very common for women to be referred to in the paper under their husband's name. Well, once he discovered how she was referred to in the paper, he discovered that she had published her recipes for kolaches. I reached out to him, and he said it was such a thrill to find this recipe in the paper, and it just about brought tears to his eyes. He was so excited. But let's look at her recipe and notice how this recipe says cook in a hot oven. Well, that was really about 375 to 400 degrees. But in 1932, some cooks were still using ovens that were heated with wood or coal. So ovens with temperature settings, even though they were invented about 1915, not everybody had one yet. So without the ability to set your oven to the right designated temperature, these home cooks became so expert at determining if the oven was at the right temperature for whatever it was they were trying to bake.
That's a great point. That's right. A lot of times it seems like the older the recipe, the more vague it sort of gets. I love this one. And you see her name at the bottom, and you see at the very top where it says, be sure and sign your name. Thank goodness that she did, right?
Right. Isn't that a treasure for that family to discover that recipe? And I'm anxious to ask them if they've tried to recreate it yet. If they've tried it, that would be fun to know. Well, it was just a thrill for Maurice to find this family recipe. But what would happen if you tried to find your ancestors' recipe and you just couldn't find it? They didn't publish a recipe in the paper. Chances are you are going to be able to find something very similar. Let me share a personal experience that just happened to me on how I found a recipe that I had been looking for. My family loves fresh English peas, and when those come on in the spring, we love to go to the farmer's market or the fruit stand and buy a bag of the English peas, and we don't even cook them. We just pot them and pop them in our mouth, and they're so delicious, and it's just really a couple of weeks in the spring when you can do that. But I've been married more than 30 years, and my husband, every year, as we pop these peas and eat them, he'll talk about and remember his grandmother's recipe that was one of his favorites for new potatoes and peas in a white sauce. So with this recipe discussion on my mind, I thought, I wonder if I can find his grandmother's recipe that he's talked about. So I started searching for her, and I did not find that she had ever published this recipe. So I thought, well, maybe somebody else to publish something similar. So I started using search terms like new potatoes and peas. And I found several recipes. There was like one with new potatoes and sausage and peas and, a few things that were similar, but not what I was looking for. So I kind of tweaked my search a little bit, and I knew it was in a white sauce. So I put new potatoes and peas and white sauce. And again, I wasn't really finding what I was looking for. And then I thought, okay, a white sauce, maybe that was cream. So I searched new potatoes and peas and cream. And when I did that, I started to see recipes for creamed new potatoes and peas. And I thought, well, maybe that's it. So I searched creamed new potatoes and peas, and I found this. I found this recipe that is, I think, probably just about identical to what his grandmother used to make. And when I showed him this recipe, he looked over it and he said, yeah, that looks like it. So we're anxious to try it. But if you look at this recipe, and this is very common in a lot of historic recipes, noticed how this is 1937, and it's talking about one of the ingredients is irradiated evaporated milk. Well, I did not know what that was, but just a little bit of searching, it just took me a minute or two, and I learned that at that time, irradiated milk simply meant that the evaporated milk was treated with ultraviolet light to get rid of any bacteria. So that's what it was.
Interesting. Oh my gosh. And you know, this makes me think about, I had received one of those old recipe books, you know, like a church would produce, you know, recipes from the congregation or that kind of thing. And I remember looking for a particular recipe, couldn't find it. But then when I focused on, like you said, just the ingredients, just the type of recipe it was, I found the woman who had published it. And when I looked her up on the census, she was a neighbor of the family.
Wait, you looked her up on the census?
Yes. So you could imagine that if you were looking in the hometown paper and you happen to find that recipe, but it's not your relative, it's very likely they knew each other, right? Because they were swapping recipes too.
Okay, that is such a great story. And remember when I said that that you might not find it under recipe? So you might, for example, let's go back to our soup example. It might say fall soups, and then it would list all the recipes, but it might not use the term recipe. So don't always, you know, it might, and you could try recipe, but I find just even using the ingredients, and can I tell you what I did last night that
Yes.
illustrates this? I grew up next door to the sweetest Greek lady, and every Christmas she would bring us over a platter of Greek cookies. And there was this one cookie, and I didn't know what it was, but it was just my favorite. And I thought, I wonder if I could figure out, this is literally last night, I wonder if I could figure out what that cookie was. So I went to the search box and I put in Greek cookies, honey, and nuts, because I knew those were 4 of the ingredients. And I quickly found, I apologize to our Greek friends, I hope I don't butcher this pronunciation, but it's melamakarna, I believe is what it's called, and it's a Greek cookie, and I made some last night.
Oh my gosh, they look amazing.
Okay, they are so good, and it like totally takes me back. I tasted one taste, and I was like, oh my gosh, and I had to like FaceTime my brother and sister and say, like, what do you remember this? And we started just laughing and talking about, you know, decorations that used to hang on her wall in her kitchen, and it just talk about a great way. If this was your family, you get people talking about food and the memories it brings back. It's so fun.
Oh, that is so awesome. I just imagine just smelling it baking in the oven probably felt like you're at you know, your relative's house.
I wish we were together so I could share some with you.
Yes, I wish. That's a great idea. I love that idea of searching for, well, we've talked about a couple of things. You've mentioned the ingredients themselves, but also thinking about the words and the language of the time that we might expect to see. And because I know sometimes if you go further back, you get receipts, not recipes, right?
Oh, yes. Some of them, you are exactly right. Some of them aren't even called recipes. They're called receipts. Right. And another thing that you might find is we are used to recipes laid out in a column format, right? Where each ingredient is listed sequentially.
Right.
A lot of historic recipes in the newspapers are just all condensed into a little paragraph with all the ingredients in there. So you kind of have to, you know, I almost have to write it out the way I'm used to try to recreate it.
It's almost like the cook, you know, was telling her daughter, well, here's how you do it. And it's the narrative really of the process of creating that.
That's probably exactly what happened too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so how can we learn more about history? Because we're talking about how this food is representative of kind of the times that people lived in and what was going on around them. What more can we learn about, in a way, our family history just by focusing on what our ancestors ate and what they were cooking?
That's such a great question because the two are so connected closely. The things that our ancestors ate, was often connected to what was going on in history and what was happening in the world around them and how it impacted what they cooked or what ingredients they could grow or purchase. One example of this is the Great Depression. How did the Great Depression impact your family? And it was probably different than my family. Was the father out of work, or the breadwinner, or were they managed? Did they manage to keep a job? Could they afford to buy food? Where were they living? If they were living in California, chances are the climate was conducive. They could probably grow a nice home garden and get the ingredients they needed. But on the other hand, if they were living in the Midwest and they were part of the Dust Bowl, that would greatly impact the food that they could get and grow food. I know I've read a lot of newspaper articles as these people that were living in this area that was affected by the Dust Bowl would try to plant crops, and swarms of grasshoppers would come in and decimate the crops. So not only were they out of work, but they were struggling to even be able to grow things. So what you'll see during the Great Depression is you'll see recipes that used cheaper food and recipes that utilized leftovers. They did not want anything going to waste. One example of this is a gelatin loaf. Now, these loaves were popular during the Great Depression, and this was a great way to use leftovers. I have a little video here that our social team made. Our social team is so great at, they find these historic recipes, some of them appealing, some of them a little less appealing, and they recreate these, and we make little videos that we post on our social channels. So if you want to see more of these, check out newspapers.com on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok, and you can see some more of these videos. But this little loaf, I don't know, Lisa, does that sound like something you'd like to maybe try?
Well, I recognize that green Jell-O. I mean, it's funny. I don't think we use it much anymore, but green Jell-O was like a staple.
Well, it didn't sound very appealing to me. This is not one that I really want to try. I'm going to leave that to our social team, but it's ham and green Jell-O, it's not sounding very good to me, but it's fun to see what, you can just imagine, boy, they didn't want anything going to waste. So they would just put in that gelatin form, whatever they could, to try to create a meal. Another thing that you would find during the Great Depression is them using anything that they could scavenge or forage to live. Dandelion greens were something that people could go outside and try to collect in the weeds, or they could purchase them at the market for a very low price. And so you will see things in the newspaper. This is a 1930 newspaper clipping that talks about and tells readers that dandelion greens are a good source of iron, and here you can soak them in water, and this is a way to make them taste a little better, and here's a good salad dressing to use over those dandelion greens. So it really gives you an insight into history. What they were eating was so connected to what was happening in history around them.
Yeah, I mean, and it talks about in that article about that they're recommended for iron content. So when you're struggling with other food sources and you know you're missing some of those vitamins, that's amazing how, I guess, capable people were to just make do and figure it out. Yes, resourceful.
They were so resourceful. It's so inspiring, really.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about California, and I was thinking about my grandparents, who my grandmother would make, deep fried chicken and hush puppies and all these things. And I'm like, nobody in California eats this. My friends didn't know what we were eating, but she was from the Oklahoma Dust Bowl, and they came out to work in the shipyards during World War II and to try to, get away from the Dust Bowl. But we were still eating like we were in Oklahoma, kind of a
Isn't
thing.
that awesome? And isn't it interesting how, wouldn't it be interesting to know if some of your friends or somebody else was inspired by this new way of cooking that she was bringing, and maybe she would share a recipe in the paper saying, have you tried hush puppies? And her neighbors would be going, hush what? You know, so it's got to see how those food trends.
And it's like a trail, isn't it? It's almost like if you didn't know where your family was from, but you had your grandmother's recipe card box, you'd have clues there about potentially what part of the country they might have come from.
I love it. That's such a great tip.
Well, what are some of the other examples that you have found of how the times kind of impacted food?
Well, World War II, you mentioned your ancestors moving there for the shipyards. World War II and rationing was a huge impact on food and the way your family members ate and cooked. Food availability during World War II was different. The world was at war, and there were supply chain issues. And we're very familiar with that right now, right? We understand, we have a better understanding right now of supply chain issues. But there was rationing, and foods like sugar, coffee, canned goods, fats, butters, oils, those things were all rationed. And in order to purchase these items at the grocery stores, family members were issued coupon or ration books. They would take these to the market. They would present the grocer with the appropriate number of stamps for what they wanted to purchase, what they were allowed to, and then the money, and they could purchase those items, but it was limited and rationed what they could purchase. So newspapers became a valuable source for these home cooks who had to learn a new way of cooking based on what they could buy. So they would, you will see all kinds of World War II ways to share recipes that relate to these food rationing and these coupon books. They had to be creative and resourceful again. So for an example, this is a newspaper clipping or a little reel, a video that our social team produced using a recipe for World War II chocolate chip cookies. And because sugar was so hard to come by, they've replaced the sugar with honey. And so they show here how to, make your best chocolate chip cookies by substituting the sugar. You will see newspapers sponsoring all kinds of contests and awarding prizes for the best wartime recipes using rationed food items or substitutions. Here's a way to make your favorite dish by substituting this hard to come by ingredient with another. So you see again the history of what was going on around them reflected. Another example of that was meat. Nicer cuts of meat required a higher number of ration points. But organ meats like kidney and liver and heart, those things had relatively low point values. So we start seeing all kinds of recipes on how to cook with those, organ meats to make them a little more palatable to people who maybe couldn't get a nicer cut of meat. Who knows? Maybe this is where some families' tradition for eating liver and onions originated at this time, connected to World War II history. We just don't know. But fresh fruits and veggies, if you could grow those were not rationed, and you could purchase those without any ration coupons. But anything that was canned or bottled or frozen, it was rationed and difficult to come by. So you will see in the papers all kinds of recipes that were focused on high nutritional value. They wanted to provide all of the vitamins and the minerals and the protein and everything you needed without using the ingredients that you were used to using. So a lot of that information was shared through the newspapers.
Wow. People really sharing their wisdom, the gain along the way, things they figured out that they could go into the newspaper and share with each other. It makes me think about the canning. Canning became so popular during World War II for victory gardens, and I have personally a passion for canning, and I collect the old canning books that Ball and Kerr used to put out. But that's got me thinking, I want to get back into the newspapers and see maybe they were publishing things about how to can and what to can.
They absolutely were, because if you had a beautiful garden that was harvesting at the end of the summer and there are scarcities and rations, you're going to want to think of some way to preserve the excess for another time, for the winter. And so canning, there's so much information about canning in the newspapers.
And did we see this continue on past World War II once things got a little bit better?
Well, there always have been, and food trends and food fads continued. They've always been around. We have them today. You know, we are constantly trying some new restaurant that has a new trend in food. But as we kind of move out of that World War II era, we start to see evidence of some of those food fads and trends. For example, in the 1950s, we start to see in the newspapers all kinds of recipes using canned pineapple. And during the 1950s and the 1960s, Americans loved anything tropical. And canned pineapple kind of represented the islands, and it was a way to share this, love of the islands and anything tropical. So here is an example of that. This is a reader-submitted recipe to a newspaper in 1954, where she is sharing her favorite pineapple cookie recipe. Well, another thing that was another kind of recipe, food fad trend in the 50s was bourbon balls. And our social team made a little video of a bourbon ball recipe, and even though these were so popular in the 1950s, they must apparently still be very popular, because this is one of our viewers' favorite recipes. They love to learn how to make bourbon balls, or at least see or remember, how bourbon balls were made. That was another popular thing in the 50s.
I have never heard of that before. Oh my God.
I hadn't either, but apparently they were quite popular.
Yeah. I remember pimentos.
Oh, pimentos were so big in the 1960s. And you will see this manifest in recipes and columns that talked about pimentos. Here is a little newspaper clipping, and it's fun because it's a hints from Louise, and she's talking about how you can use pimentos to liven up your casseroles and your salads, and it makes me giggle, because she gives advice on how to get the most beautiful thinly sliced pimentos and how to make the perfect little cuts that will bring your salads and your casseroles to life. People loved pimentos in the 1960s.
Oh my gosh. I don't even know if kids today would even know what they were. And I see, again, ladies' names here, Mrs. Jared Esler. So, I mean, we're seeing names in a housekeeping type of column too.
Oh, and you would have to think that had to have been an honor. If your recipe was chosen to be published in the newspaper, that had to have been quite an honor out of all the recipes that were submitted. So how fun if you can find your ancestor's name as one who was chosen to be published in the paper. And that's fun. I mean, you'd just want to try it, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Well, and you made a good recommendation that sometimes we might look for, if it's a woman, her first and last name, but also perhaps her married name, with using her husband's name. I know sometimes I even saw they used initials. So it was like Mrs. J.B. Moore. And even though JB would be her husband. So, but if we do that within the context of a location, a paper from that area, then we should have better luck, right?
Yes, that's such a good point, because those initials, that JB Moore could be James Buchanan Moore. And if we're searching for James B. or James Buchanan Moore, we may not find her name at all. So I always adjust my parameters wider and narrower. I would definitely try just the last names, or J Moore, or I just try every variation. When I'm looking for my ancestors, I don't want any stone left unturned, so I'm going to try every variation of a name. But it is so common. These food columns are generally women, and it's so common for them to be referred to under their husband's name.
Exactly. Now, you and I were talking, and you were saying in the 1980s there was an excess of cheese. What was that about?
Yes, well, it really kind of goes back almost to World War II. The government started producing processed cheese, and it was used in, well, the government didn't produce it. They actually started, it was a commodity, and it was price controlled. And processed cheese was used in military kitchens. It was used in school cafeterias. And starting in, that started to be, because it was a commodity and price controlled, the government actually started storing this cheese. And the supply got larger and larger. And by the 1980s, there was such an excess of cheese. There were more than 2 pounds stored for every living American.
Wow.
And so that's a lot of cheese, right?
Yeah.
So in 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed the Agricultural and Food Act, and he began to distribute all of this stockpiled cheese. So as a result, in the 1980s, you're going to start seeing all kinds of recipes on how to use this processed cheese and what to do with it. It was commonly a commonly used ingredient, and along with it came recipes on how to cook with it.
How interesting. Oh my gosh. National history tying into family history, tying into newspapers.
Well, it's so true, and it'd be interesting to go into newspapers and learn more about that. Why was the government controlling the price of powdered milk and cheese? And there's so much history that could be learned. You can learn it in the newspapers.
Yeah, boy, that'd be a great assignment, if you're working with your kids and having them kind of look into the history of things. How have recipes changed? I imagine that as we look through the different decades of newspapers, we start to see a pattern or an evolution.
That's exactly right. And there's so many ways. Let's talk about just a few of them. One of the ways is some of the ingredients that you will see listed in a recipe, you don't know what that is. It's no longer available or it doesn't exist. Here's an example on this clipping of one. This is a product called Eggo, not to be confused with frozen waffles. Oh. This was a really popular egg substitute. And so you see a lot of recipes. This is 1918. You see a lot of recipes about this time where they call for Eggo. So if you see something that you don't recognize, you can do just a few little searches in newspapers and figure out, oh, okay, it's an egg substitute. I could try a different egg substitute, or I could try real eggs, and I could still try to recreate my ancestors' recipe, but I might need to tweak just a little bit. Another way that there are differences is package sizes are different than they were. For example, if you're making a recipe that calls for a package of graham crackers, they're not even packaged the same. We have rectangular sleeves now that are packed with graham crackers. Well, in older times, they were squares, and that package size would have been different. It reminds me a little bit, I don't know how many years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, they changed the packaging for Baker's chocolate. And I have a couple of recipes that call for, 3 squares of Baker's chocolate. And every time I come across one of those recipes, I think, okay, now, is that the old packaging? And I have to go Google and remember how many of the new squares equals the old squares. So that's just in the past decade. You can imagine over decades and decades how packaging and things would change a little bit.
Absolutely. I had somebody who was teaching me some cooking in the past. She said to me, in the end, you have to trust yourself. You have good instincts. And particularly if you're using older recipes, don't panic, because you look at what you're doing so far and you say, what would be a reasonable amount? Think about how it equates to another recipe. So we don't have to panic about the package. Just think about it in terms of what makes sense. And it really kind of freed me up to be more flexible with recipes I have, but also to be able to use some of my older ones that I was feeling like I couldn't because I don't know what size that is.
Okay, what a great tip. I love that tip, Lisa.
Yeah.
That's great. Another thing you'll find in historic newspapers is that the actual recipe was written different, and they might use hyphens instead of slashes for fractions. So here's an example of a clipping. And if you looked at this recipe, it might look like it says add 2 to 3 cups of sugar, but in reality, it's 2/3 cup of sugar. So it wasn't that uncommon for some of those recipes to get rid of that slash and use a hyphen. So if you come across that, don't panic. It's probably meant 2/3, not 2 to 3 cups.
That could make a big difference, couldn't it?
It could make a big difference. It could make a big difference. But another difference is some products no longer exist. And let me give you an example of that. If you have your grandmother's favorite banana bread recipe, you could recreate that, but it's never going to taste exactly the same. And the reason is because the bananas are different. In the 1950s, there was a disease that wiped out the banana crops, and those bananas were called Gros Michel variety of bananas, and they completely got wiped out. So the growers started growing a kind called Cavendish, and that's what you and I buy at the grocery store today. So we could take Grandma's recipe for banana bread, and we can recreate it exactly, but those bananas taste a little differently, so it's still going to taste a little different.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So how did you figure out the history on that? Oh my gosh.
Newspapers.
Yeah, newspapers.
There's so many articles in the 1950s about this, this Gros Michel. That was the variety that all the stores stocked. And can you imagine if suddenly everything that, you were used to, the crop was wiped out and they introduced something new? So there's so many interesting historical things in the papers that tie into the way that we were eating and that we still do eat.
Mm-hmm.
Another example of that is sour milk. You will see so many recipes. In fact, you know what? I have a recipe. I had a friend that called the other day and she's like, "Can I get your recipe for a German chocolate cake?" And I said, "Sure." And I pulled my binder where I keep all my recipes off the shelf, and I was amazed how many newspaper clippings I have tucked into my own personal collection. But I have a recipe that's a sugar cookie recipe that calls for sour milk. But today I just take milk and I add a little bit of lemon juice or vinegar to make sour milk. But back before milk was pasteurized, it soured very quickly. But cooks discovered that when you combine sour milk with baking soda, there was a chemical reaction, and it was just like you were using baking powder. And in fact, that chemical reaction took out the sour taste. So because milk was not pasteurized and it would sour quickly, these cooks came up with all these ways to use that sour milk. So here's a little example in this clipping of all kinds of recipes, everything from baked goods to dressings to casseroles that are made using sour milk. And they tried to figure out a way to use every bit of what they had.
Oh, I bet. Rather than having to toss something out, they just couldn't afford to. You've got to find a way to use it.
Right. And another important thing to keep in mind when you're looking or trying historic recipes is that standardized measurements didn't come out until the Victorian era. So, and even then, they took a while to catch on. So it's not uncommon, even up until about the 1940s, to see recipes that say, add a teacup full of sugar, or add butter the size of an egg, or stir in a gill of milk. And a gill of milk was about 4 ounces. Here's an example of a clipping that talks about making a custard using a gill of milk. So, it's not uncommon on older recipes, but I love your advice about, kind of do what makes sense. If it says butter the size of an egg, we can all kind of figure out that's, maybe 4 tablespoons, maybe half a cube of butter. You kind of have to use your best judgment a little bit and try. But those standardized measurements you won't find in older recipes.
Well, that's interesting. Do you have a sense of when did they start putting recipes into newspapers? I know they added society columns, and particularly in local papers, they're trying to fill some space. How far back would we expect to see something like that?
I think that they're readily available all throughout the 1900s. In the late 1800s, you still see some. They're not quite as many. There may be some earlier than that. I haven't focused too much on those earlier recipes. I think you probably could find, we have papers that go back to 1690. I don't think those earliest papers we're going to find recipes, but particularly there's so many recipes in the late 1800s and the 1900s in the newspaper.
Absolutely. And it might vary, I would imagine, just paper to paper, community to community. And
I think so. Yes, some communities every paper had a food column, but not every paper had a food column. And so you might see that in one community and not in another.
I'm so excited to try all these strategies. You've given us a lot of advice. Any other advice or tips as we get out into newspapers looking for old food recipes?
Well, I think my best advice, honestly, is to start a conversation with your family. As I called my brother and sister last night, and I was showing them the Greek cookies that we remembered from growing up, we just started, the memory started flooding back. And do you remember when this? And do you remember when this happened? And if you are together with your family, your extended family, start talking. Those oral histories are so packed full of information. Ask your parents or your grandparents, what was a common thing you had for dinner every night? And when those floodgates open of memories, that oral history will just reveal so many interesting things about your family history and what was happening in the world around them that impacted how they ate and what they cooked.
Oh, terrific. Well, newspapers.com is definitely a great place to go. We so appreciate that you come and share so many ideas. Tell us a little bit more about how they can find newspapers.com and what they will find there.
Well, go to newspapers.com. You will find, I think we have now close to 775 million pages of newspapers. And like I said, these go back to the 1600s. You will find papers from every single state, from countries around the world like Canada, the UK, Australia, Ireland, Panama. Start going to those papers, look for your family recipes. If you don't see your family, start and you found, that you have this long lost family recipe that everybody talks about and nobody has it. Start adding ingredients in the search engine, and I think you're going to find it. It's in there somewhere. Recipes that you call one name might be a different name. Like I have a recipe that I make that's called hootenanny pancakes. And it's German pancakes, but everybody calls them something different. And so what you're looking for may not be the name that you think it is, but try a variety of names or try ingredients. Of course, it's most exciting if you can find your own family in there and their own published recipes. But just try lots of different search parameters and have fun. It's so fun, and it's such an interesting insight into history and family history.
It certainly is. Oh, Jenny, thank you so much for joining us. And we got to figure out a way to be able to share food through this whole webinar thing. I mean, I feel like I'm missing out. Send me the recipe, okay?
If I could catch a flight by this afternoon, I could be on your doorstep tonight with these cookies.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.